Good afternoon and welcome to MIT's Compton Lecture. I'm delighted that so many of you have joined us today. After the lecture, our Vice President for Research, Maria Zuber, will lead a conversation with Professor Moniz, and will ask questions drawn from the MIT community members who were submitted in advance. So let me put some context. In 1957, MIT established the Compton Lectures to honor the memory of MIT's 10th president, Carl Taylor Compton. He had led MIT for almost a quarter of a century in two roles, first as president for 18 years. Where is Susan? 18 years. From 1930 to 1948, and then as chairman of the MIT Corporation. He guided MIT through the Great Depression and World War II. In the process, he helped MIT transform itself from an outstanding technical school for training hands-on engineers to a great global university. A distinguished physicist, President Compton brought a new focus on fundamental scientific research, and he made science an equal partner with engineering at MIT. During the war, he helped invent a partnership between the federal government and America's research universities. And as a result of all these efforts, and under his watch, MIT was awarded its first Nobel Prize in physics in 1944. Today we celebrate Dr. Compton's legacy by honoring another distinguished physicist who embodies MIT's tradition of service, the Cecil and Ida Green Professor of Physics and Engineering Systems Emeritus, and, very importantly, Special Advisor to the MIT President, Ernest Moniz. Professor Moniz has a record of accomplishment that would stand out in any context. But for this audience, I would like to frame it as an MIT ideal. According to Ernest's calculations, precise calculations, I would add, he was an active member of the MIT faculty for 39.89 years. In that time, he achieved the kind of excellence we expect from faculty. He did groundbreaking work in theoretical nuclear physics. He served as the head of the physics department. He directed the Base Linear Accelerator. He also served the White House and the Department of Energy under President Bill Clinton. And then, in 2006, MIT's 16th president, Susan Hockfield, focused the MIT community on the great global problem of inventing a sustainable energy future. She knew that the MIT Energy Initiative, or MITI, would require a founding leader with exceptional intellectual depth and breadth, outstanding political skill, and unlimited personal energy. The obvious choice was Ernie. In partnership with President Hockfield, Ernie put MIT at the center of the national conversation on energy. So it was no surprise when President Obama nominated him, Ernie, to serve as the 13th US Secretary of Energy. And it was no surprise, at least to us, when the Senate voted to confirm him 97-0. At DOE, Professor Moniz led the implementation of an all-of-the-above energy strategy, accelerating innovation in renewable energy technologies, advanced energy storage, and next-generation nuclear power. He led an international initiative to make sure that the global response to climate change was grounded in energy science and technology innovation. And he made great strides in stabilizing the nation's nuclear strategy and security, including working with Secretary of State John Kerry to negotiate the historic nuclear agreement with Iran. A native of Massachusetts, Professor Moniz is a committed global citizen and an extraordinary citizen of MIT. And we're deeply grateful for his service to the nation and the world, and we're thrilled that he has come home. Please welcome the 13th U.S. Secretary of Energy, Ernest Moniz.
Thank you, Raphael, for those kind words, and it is good to be home and to see so many familiar people. It's great, and but I also want to thank the entire community for, tolerating the behavior of the last 40 years of being here sometimes, being away, wandering off to Washington 3 times actually for serving the administration. You talked about Compton, obviously, and I just want to note that when I came to MIT, 73, Jerry Wiesner was the president. In my own department, many figures who had played major roles after World War II, 50s and 60s, in terms of public service, while, of course, serving the institute and the students and the faculty. But one in particular, Herman Feshbach, was really a mentor. He was a founder of the Panel on Public Affairs of the American Physical Society. And so I guess I can't resist telling a story that came up at lunch today when I hadn't thought about it, but which was when I was here just 2-3 years, Herman, who was then head of the Department of Physics as well, Herman said, well, at this Panel on Public Affairs, we're starting a new study, a big study on nuclear fuel cycles and waste management. And I want you to be on the study group, even though it was filled with people like chemical engineers and the like, so it was the first exposure to this multidisciplinary activity. So I told Herman that I actually didn't know anything about this subject, and it didn't make sense. He said, that's perfect. Then I said, well, my real argument, there is this little tenure thing coming up in 2 or 3 years. And he said, if you don't do this, you're not worth it. So yes, sir. And, but it actually, it was a great experience, and it really was the beginning of a trajectory in terms of studying a number of these issues. But more important, I think, with Jerry, with Herman, and with so many others that I could name, this place had just such a dedication to public service, and I think that really is a major part of, again, for better or worse, the trajectory that I have been on. I do want to note, I'll come back and mention a few others, but do note that I actually have a couple of colleagues from the administration here. Sally Jewell here was in contrast to the 13th Secretary of Energy, you must have been like the 200th Secretary of the Interior. It's such an old department. How many? 51? 51st. And it's great for Sally to come. And then Dan Poneman was the Deputy Secretary when I arrived at DOE. But he and I, and actually even John Deutsch, we have even a publication record going back into the early part of this century. So anyway, now I'm back. What Raphael didn't say is that I'm my official on the contract. It actually says professor post tenure, which reminds me of the words on the official proclamation of presidential nominees, that you serve for the time being. In other words, I continue to serve at the pleasure of a president, but certainly looking forward to it. So let me just say a couple things about the Department of Energy as kind of a background for the discussion, because being there these last 4 years really was a very special opportunity, and I'll explain that. First of all, I think many probably don't really know, understandably, the scope of the department's activities. what we whimsically labeled the missions of the Department of Energy as weapons and windmills, corks and quagmires. And that's serious, actually. The weapons means that we are the repository, essentially, of nuclear security knowledge, technology, and the like, nuclear weapons, nuclear nonproliferation issues, nuclear navy propulsion. Windmills, obviously, we are Department of Energy, I should say. If I say we, I mean we of 8 months ago or whatever it is. The department is the lead for clean energy technology innovation and other elements of energy technology and policy. The Quarks is something MIT people feel at home with. Quarks is to represent the fact that the department is the largest supporter of the physical sciences in the United States, and in particular, at most of its 17 national laboratories, supports the major facilities that many of the scientists here, faculty and students and postdocs and the like, and staff are using all the time, accelerators and neutron sources and light sources. And the quagmires is the relic of the Cold War in cleaning up what can only be called the damn mess left behind by the weapons production. So it's very diverse, but what I want to emphasize is for every one of the missions, it's fundamentally about applying science and technology. So DOE is at its core a science and technology organization, a very powerful one, and that's really what we do. Now, the reason that I said it was a very special opportunity to be at the department in these last years, specifically in the second term of President Obama, was that he put the clean energy climate agenda and the nuclear security agenda really very high in the set of priorities. So frankly, we had just a very an opportunity to fail or succeed, but an opportunity to be engaged in really major presidential priorities, and that is reflected in two of the major episodes, certainly that I had a chance to be part of, and that was the road to Paris for the climate discussions, the climate agreement, and the Iran negotiation, as mentioned earlier, both of which took place in 2015, which I'll never forget, 2015. It was a hell of a year. But on the nuclear security side, let's just say that the president, very early in his term, within months, April of 2009, in a well-known speech in Prague, laid out a big nuclear security agenda, kind of soup to nuts with nuclear materials, nuclear weapons, nuclear proliferation, et cetera. And that was not a common thing for the president to come out and put that as a high priority there. Secondly, on the clean energy and climate, I think I can say that, well, first of all, even in the first term, in 2009, many of you may recall, there was a little thing called the Recovery Act. We had some economic problems at the time, and there was an enormous Recovery Act. For the first time, the president in that situation made enormous new expenditures in clean energy, including establishing programs like ARPA-E, there are probably some awardees here, programs like the Energy Frontier Research Centers, which look at basic science challenges for future energy technologies. Those were all funded as a priority in the recovery package. Again, another kind of unusual step forward. Fast forwarding, at the beginning of the second term in June, then came the announcement of the Climate Action Plan, and I think that was copyrighted, Raphael, even though you've chosen to copy that term here, but anyway, but again, it was a statement that this was going to be a real priority in the second term, and frankly, when I had my job interview, both of these subjects came up. Frankly, it was like 30 minutes on climate and 15 minutes and energy and 15 minutes on the nuclear security issues, and so it was kind of like in the wheelhouse. So that was really great. So it was again a really special time to be there. So today I'll make some remarks that derive from the Paris and Iran activities in climate and nuclear security. The phrasing of reducing global threats is the way we are looking at this. And by global threats, I mean the areas where there is a potential for mass destruction and/or disruption, and both climate and nuclear security, I think, fit in there. They require also global or at least multilateral responses in both cases. And they are very different in the nature of the threat. I mean, climate change and global warming, I would say is kind of like a slow-motion train wreck that threatens major environmental, economic, and national security problems, whereas nuclear weapons or the use of nuclear weapons obviously would be a very different, we hope a very low probability but very high consequence, a singular kind of event. But again, some commonalities in terms of how to replace it. Now, 25 years ago, 1990, let's say 1992 as a benchmark year, it seemed that we were on the path to managing both of these major problems. For climate and therefore having the chance to really focus on economic and environmental and other kinds of needs, including developments in less developed countries and the like. And in fact, I would say in those years, in the 90s, and I did serve in the Clinton administration twice, there was a period of that, but also lurking problems that would then come around to bite us, like the development of global terrorism with global reach, for example, and when it came time to the Kyoto discussions, even though there was nominally agreement, you could see plenty of seeds of problems to come, and I'll come back to that a little bit. But in June of 1992 is when the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted, and we have forgotten, and it's important to remember in the current context, I think, that was ratified in the Senate. It is a treaty, and I'll just quote the commitment in there to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. That is something to which we are committed in that treaty. The same kind of period, beginning of the 90s, on nuclear security side, of course, the Soviet Union had disintegrated peacefully. There was the orderly delivery of nuclear weapons to Russia from Kazakhstan and Belarus and Ukraine. There was a focus on securing and eliminating both nuclear weapons and nuclear materials that could be used for WMD and D. So again, global threat reduction looked to be in good shape, but events of the last year and months, the June announcement by the President on the Paris Accord, and even in the last days, such as the discussion, the speech at the UN General Assembly 2 days ago on Iran and North Korea, obviously have painfully displayed kind of the forces of regression, is the only thing that I could say about that. So again, terrorism a global risk. In the 90s, the nature of the NATO, EU expansions, the dizzying advances in technology that hold so much promise but yet potential for peril, those were all in that time period, I think, kind of harbingers of some of the challenges that were to come and that we still face. I might just want to add one other global threat that I will not discuss today in detail, but that is in the life sciences, synthetic biology developments, things like global travel, pandemics, et cetera. It's another area clearly where there's a global threat to be addressed. But again, I think today I'll just stay with these two and make some comments on the climate and nuclear security agendas. These I will be personally pursuing through MIT, through an organization called the Nuclear Threat Initiative and another called the Energy Futures Initiative. But of course, at MIT, there's lots and lots of work addressing all of these. Certainly a very distinguished set of faculty and students contributing in the climate regime, and have been and will be for a long time. MIGHTY, the MIT Energy Initiative, in terms of facilitating an enormous amount of research on campus to advance solutions. And on nuclear threats, I just saw today from course 22, do you want nuclear security? And I was wondering, is it a trick question? I've been thinking about this a long time, and I think the answer is yes. But anyway, I guess that's what you learn if you sign up in course 22. So let me make some comments in the climate arena. I already noted the UN Framework Convention is in place. Now, that framework, of course, does need an interpretation of what the words dangerous anthropogenic activity are. But such an interpretation is meaningful only when it's based on science. And there's been a remarkable international scientific progress that is part and parcel of that convention. So, you know, bluntly, especially from the point of view of a policymaker who has to make prudent judgments and risk management in a certain sense, in my view, it is completely laughable to say that the state of the science is not one that says that we must, in fact, have a strong, prudent response in the climate arena. A second issue, and by the way, I should say, you know, 197 countries are signed up to that framework convention. So, you know, there is a commitment to address this issue globally, going back 25 years. A second issue also contained in that framework convention was the famous phrase about common but differentiated responsibilities, another thing to be interpreted and implemented. And then at Kyoto, let's just say the differentiation part was emphasized quite strongly and were the seeds of the problems there. Indeed, Congress again spoke in that time period. There was the Byrd-Hagel resolution that was unanimous and said that the U.S. commitments could only come together with developing world commitments, read China there. In other words, they emphasized the common in terms of the common but differentiated responsibilities. But guess what? Anybody look at the Paris Accord? It's victory. There is, in fact, shared responsibilities between developing and developed worlds. In fact, I would argue with commitments that are in just about every sense, comparable in terms of the scale. I mean, obviously there are variations, but in fact, this path has led us to where we wanted to go. In addition, the administration, including Administrator Pruitt from EPA, has made it very clear that the Supreme Court has spoken and that there is an obligation to regulate carbon dioxide under the Clean Air Act. So how you implement it is one thing, and the administration, after much work, and another of our colleagues, Gina McCarthy, another Boston-based person, really was the point person on that, and so that went forward. So really a 25-year process kind of really holds together with the only real argument being quantitative. You know, is the target 27% or 29 or 24%? This kind of a thing. So in that context, we really need to evaluate where we stand in terms of the uncertainty that's now been cast into the system by the President's June announcement. But first, before I turn to that, let me make a second point about Paris. It was made earlier that mission innovation was another agreement at Paris. Mission Innovation was an agreement by 20 countries at the time, it's a little bit more now, who committed to doubling clean energy innovation investments, resources, over a 5-year ramp-up period. In parallel with a group of investors represented in Paris by Bill Gates, representing investors from 10 countries, who were prepared to put in big dollars with patience to advance that innovation agenda into the marketplace. Unfortunately, administration's actions have not only led to the statement about withdrawing or starting the process of withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, but it also, unfortunately, proposed a budget that would address this pillar of innovation as well. Specifically, the factor of 2 in mission innovation is now appearing in the denominator instead of the numerator in the budget proposal. Now, I don't think Congress is going to go along with that, but it is a real issue. I might add that the clean energy transformation, of course, is the core, is the biggest piece, if you like, of responding to greenhouse gas emissions. But especially with my friend Sally Jewell here, we have to say another big piece is around land use and forestry and the like. And so it's certainly a broader set of activities. Now, going to the science, I mean, again, so the announcements by the administration on both Paris Accord and innovation really take you to the science. By the way, I should have added, just in case some may not know, that the actual date at which the United States could withdraw, given the President's announcement, is actually November the 4th, 2020, which is essentially the end of this term. But you can make of that what you wish. But certainly, thinking about the underlying science, which we mentioned briefly earlier, it's very hard to say that and kind of resist the temptation of commenting on hurricanes. Although is Kerry Emanuel here? I don't know if Kerry spoke about this yesterday. The recent hurricanes, et cetera. And Kerry, a quote from Kerry Emanuel in EAPS is that, quotes, "We would expect a significant increase in the extremes of storm intensification." So what I would emphasize is that, in many ways it's always about water, and water is higher, water is warmer, the air carries more water because of the warming, and it certainly is no surprise that there's an amplifier on the effects of these tropical storms that unfortunately we have seen recently in Texas and Louisiana and Florida and other places. It's also a question of adaptation. And actually, can we just show I have these just 2 slides, these 2 little pictures. This is a picture, David Sandelos provided these to me. This is just a picture of nothing but sea level rise with 2 degrees centigrade of warming in Shanghai, and the next one is 4 degrees. Gives you an idea. Now, obviously, in Shanghai, they're going to be able to afford some adaptation. And this is not a storm. This is just regular sea level rise with Shanghai. But adaptation, to give you a benchmark, one utility in Florida that you've been reading about quite a bit recently with Hurricane Irma, Florida Power and Light has spent almost $4 billion just in their service territory doing things like hardening assets, preventing floods in substations, et cetera. $4 billion at one utility. So you get an idea how this can scale and why the scientific and analytical communities have been emphasizing long term, it's a lot cheaper to mitigate this and work hard on mitigation than it is on adaptation, but we will have to do both. It also reminds me of this is the This is roughly the 1000th anniversary of King Canute ordering the waves off the beach. But, you know, there's often a misinterpretation that somehow King Canute was vain in ordering this. It's actually the opposite, according to legend, that he was humble and wanted to show his court that even he could not order the waves off the beach. A little more humility today would not be a bad idea in this context. But anyway, that's a separate story. So the issue really is, so what happens now with the announcement on June 1st? The thing I would say, number one, is there's no going back. We are heading to a low-carbon future. I think it's clearly there in the cards, and therefore, if we don't pursue the kind of trajectory that we were on, I think we're going to end up in more or less the same place down the road, but it will be a rougher road to get there without federal leadership. Secondly, that development means that there will be a multi-trillion-dollar market. It's developing now. It's going to develop further, and no matter what you think on the climate side, the fact is decreasing our innovation programs just don't make a lot of sense in terms of where we're going to be in that future marketplace. And indeed, one of the most encouraging aspects of the aftermath of the President's announcement was the way mayors, governors, and business leaders, almost 1,400 business leaders, stepping forward to say, well, that's fine announcement, we're on our track, we're staying on our track. And I think the issue is they recognize that they have to make, you know, capital allocations, et cetera, with decadal timescales. They agree we're not going back. Frankly, a lot of disappointment that when the planning environment for them looked to be pretty settled, now it's kind of a little bit scrambled, but the reality is continuing the path forward. So that's really important. And in that path forward, innovation will be critical, and I mean innovation in technology, in policy, and in business models. Now, on the technology side, and actually I should say, we're talking here also, I want to emphasize, not just about the Paris goals, let's say 27% reduction 2025 for the United States, but we're talking about what you really need to do, especially in the industrialized economies, for deep decarbonization, let's say in the mid-century time frame. To get there, on the technology side, there are two elements that are absolutely common to any credible or nearly credible explanation of getting to the deep decarbonization, and that is there has to be demand-side success, energy efficiency and the like across the board, buildings, transportation, industry, and we have to effectively decarbonize the electricity system. Where there are many options to do that, I'm not saying it's easy, but if we don't get the electricity system decarbonized, nuclear power, renewables, carbon capture and sequestration, certainly for a while, coal substituted by gas, which has been a big part of our carbon reductions in the last years. All of those have to be pushed, and we have to succeed in decarbonizing the electricity sector if we have any chance of a broader economy-wide decarbonization. But what follows from that, then, is if you've decarbonized the electricity sector, then you want to electrify as much else as you can. So, light-duty vehicles, for example, many opportunities there. However, there is the hard truth. It's very hard for me to see how electrifying the transportation sector, electrifying the industry sector is going to get us all the way to where we want to go. And that's where the arguments that some use that stop this innovation nonsense, we have all the tools we need I just don't buy it. I think we're going to need some very deep innovation to get to deep decarbonization across all of these sectors. Too often, when you are shown some wonderful graphs that show carbon emissions going down to almost nothing, what they're showing you is the electricity sector and not the full economy, which leads to another thing that I think we have to do more. Therefore, we also have to look at other greenhouse gases besides CO2, methane. Very important. Another very important agreement in 2015 was extending the Montreal Protocol to get rid of hydrofluorocarbons. That's worth probably a ½ degree centigrade of warming in this century. And we need large-scale carbon management as a supplement to all of these. I might say that at DOE, we had a Secretary of Energy Advisory Board, CAB. The distinguished Professor Deutsch was the chair of that board, which did yeoman's work on many subjects. And I might say, and President Huckfield took part in one of those activities as well, and others here. But their last report of CAB was, in fact, answering the question about what were pathways, both engineered pathways and biological pathways, to large-scale carbon management, et cetera. So I think there's a tremendous science and technology, deep innovation agenda that we don't have a lot of time to waste in pursuing that. I also mentioned innovation in policy and in business model. I think there isn't a lot of time to discuss this, but I'll just say there are movements such as from a group of conservatives, excuse me, self-named, George Shultz, Jim Baker, and others, talking about a so-called carbon neutral, a revenue neutral carbon tax with a trade which is progressive, but also would entail a trade of some elements of regulation and subsidy being removed. I think that's a very interesting discussion and one that could go forward. That's the kind of innovation we need. And let me say that with that kind of innovation, we can see, at least models tell us, we can see really accelerating the clean energy transformation, because it's really the synergy between technology progress and policy to give the price signals that can really help accelerate the deployment of these technologies. And business model innovation will also be critical. Again, given the time, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but an obvious case would be, in urban environments, autonomous personal mobility devices and different ownership models, all kinds of issues linked into the grid. And in fact, the full integration of IT, so-called behind the meter, is going to be a very, very important area. And frankly, there can be a collision here between the utilities and the big data companies, the big 5 data companies. I say as a joke, the biggest energy story of the last months was Amazon buys Whole Foods, to indicate how the big data companies can really move in the commodity space and do all kinds of linked activities. How the regulatory process plays out will be critical in shaping how that possible competition turns out. So anyway, I think that there are, again, there's reasons for concern, obviously, but there's also lots of reasons to be hopeful. Again, the mayors, the governors, the business people behind it, the technology opportunities going forward, and the fact that we are seeing things like these business model innovations being experimented with all over the place. It's got to get pulled together, and it's got to get moving quickly, because we don't have a whole lot of time to waste. Okay, let me just make and now for something completely different, nuclear security. A few comments on nuclear security. And I have to say, the bad news is, in my view, the risk of miscalculation, of misunderstanding, leading to the possible use of a nuclear weapon for the first time since World War II, I think is higher today than probably any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's whether you look at North Korea, India, Pakistan, NATO, Russia, there are all kinds of opportunities for misunderstandings right now that could lead to bad outcomes. Iran now is a different case, not having nuclear weapons, verifiably without a program, although, again, the speech a couple days ago suggests that, you know, we've got 3 big problems, why not make it 4? But we will see. So let me just make a few comments on Russia, and so these will just be specific comments on Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and then we can go to the discussion. On Russia, I just want to note one recent development that is a cause of concern, but could be turned into an opportunity. And that is that, as many of you know, the Congress recently passed a sanctions bill in which it essentially took some of the prerogatives traditionally placed with the president. There is not a good history of this encouraging dialogue. For example, there was something I won't go into in detail called the Jackson-Vanik sanctions in the 1970s, 1976, and after the president certified that then it was Russia, no longer the Soviet Union, then Russia was in compliance, it still took Congress 15 more years to lift the sanctions. Kind of got tied up with chicken exports. And I'm not making it up. But that's the kind of political dynamic that one gets in when you get into the congressional political. So we can understand why that occurred in the current situation. But what we've proposed, and this is with former Senator Sam Nunn, we proposed to use a model that was successfully used in the 1980s during the Reagan administration. Namely, first of all, we feel that it is absolutely essential that we resume serious discussions with Russia on these nuclear security threats. It's too important. It was too important in the Cold War to stop those discussions. They are essentially stopped. Military-to-military conversations are way, way down. And so that's what can lead to miscalculations. So we need to have that. The action by the Congress, in our view, essentially eliminates the political space if the Department of State or the Department of Defense want to have those discussions, especially given the history that I mentioned. So what we propose is that a model used, again, as I said, in arms control negotiations in the 80s, get re-implemented with a liaison group from the Congress to the administration, invited by the Secretaries of State and Defense to act as an ongoing liaison group so that if the opportunity is there to use some political space, it gives political space to them for the discussions, and it tells Russia, in this case, that if they talk, they're not wasting their time. That there's an opportunity to move something forward. Because right now, in this situation and in other situations where it's getting to the point where if we start out of Paris, out of Iran, out of everything, question trade, et cetera, who's going to want to talk to us? What's the point, right? So anyway, so that's an example of trying to think of some kind of creative approaches that we can get ourselves out of this box and have kind of dialogue. Okay, let me talk about Iran. And obviously, there's a big decision by the president coming up in October. It's very important to understand what the Iran deal is and what it's not. It is only about nuclear. It is not about Hezbollah and Yemen and Syria and missiles, et cetera. And it is about very strong verification. And it is about buying, if you like, a decade or 15 years of time, which should be used wisely rather than just used as a period of complaint. So pulling out of that deal, if that is where we go, is very inimical to our interests, particularly because it's almost certain that the 3 European countries in the negotiation, the EU, Russia and China, and Iran will, quotes, all stay in the deal. And then where do we go? If the issue is that the president refuses to certify compliance, even though the IAEA says they're doing everything they're supposed to do, and the Congress puts on new sanctions, which are actually would be the deal breaker, our European friends are not going to be very happy. And it would be one more opportunity, quotes, in fact, to further put a wedge between us and our allies, a structure that's been built up with the United States in the lead ever since World War II. So this is a big deal if there really is compliance, as opposed to complaining about justifiably complaining about Iran's behavior in other dimensions that are not part of the deal. We've got to address those dimensions. So let's work with the partners on those things more aggressively, and let's plan for, quotes, the day after, when when elements of the agreement expire in 10, 12, 15 years. What do we want? For example, maybe the way to do this is, I'll just pick one example. They have unique verification measures in the Iran deal. A lot of those would be great to have more broadly, others following them, giving an incentive also for Iran to stay. So there's a lot of thinking to do, a lot of ground to prepare, and all we're doing is wasting time with these arguments in a situation in which there is compliance. And I might add, the time part is not trivial, because the young generation in Iran is clearly going to be very helpful in terms of charting a path forward. Finally, just a few comments on North Korea. In Iran, as I said, the negotiation was focused strictly on nuclear issues. In my view, the focus on only nuclear weapons in Korea is the wrong strategy. That this is a question now of looking at the underlying realities of security for North Korea, South Korea, Japan, and China. We have not had a serious dialogue with China. All we do is tell them, stop buying coal, stop sending this. We are not addressing all the issues that China is really concerned about in security, and frankly, a reason is because it would require us to discuss some hard issues that maybe we don't want to discuss particularly. Missile defense, reunification in the peninsula, all kinds of issues. So I think that, and not only me, others, we think that what we need to do, we need to start diplomacy. And diplomacy does not consist of choosing the most colorful words that you can think of. And that diplomacy starts with China and South Korea and Japan, so that we can get, which is very analogous to the Iran negotiation in the sense that although the United States was the face-to-face negotiator with Iran, it was representing a group convened by the EU of 3 Russian companies, 3 European companies, Russia and China countries. And so we need to get a framework together with our allies and with China so that we can then start a dialogue with North Korea that is meaningful and addresses the overall security concerns that maybe with time will lead to success in the denuclearization goal that we have. But a common thread in all three of those discussions, obviously, is a strongly held view, certainly on our part, that that we have got to get back into the business of diplomacy and really make serious progress on these issues. So that's what I guess wanted to ramble on about. But again, going back to the beginning, to say that it really was a great time to be at the Department of Energy, carrying on with the essential activities in terms of basic science, et cetera, but also having these areas where we could make great progress. And now all of us in civil society hopefully can sustain some of that progress and build on it going forward. So thank you very much.
Ernie, thank you for that wisdom and for your commitment. Let's see. So we had a whole lot of questions submitted from the MIT community, and I put them into groups, and I'll ask one or two from every category. And my categorization.
And I haven't seen them.
You have not seen them.
Right.
Correct. So and in fact, they're in the opposite, approximately the opposite order of the way your speech went. So I'm just going to start. So let's start with Iran. Okay. So politicians as well as the media seem to talk or worry about possible deviations of Iran's nuclear activities from being peaceful, but they don't seem to be as worried about the many nuclear weapons that already exist all around the world. And for that matter, why are the United States nuclear weapons don't seem to be as much of a concern either?
Well, first of all, the use of any nuclear weapon by anybody, again, is the primary objective is to prevent that use. And this is not quite the question. I'll come back to that. And I want to distinguish that from the disarmament discussions. Disarmament is a good thing, but we, and certainly the organization that I'm with now, but we say, yeah, that is important. However, right now, what's really important is to make sure the weapon isn't used, right? So that's kind of the framework. With Iran, we also should keep in mind that there has been a significant reduction in the stockpiles of the United States and Russia. Secondly, that there has been no testing of nuclear weapons, of nuclear explosives in this century other than by North Korea, right? So some things are positive. I can go into many negative developments. But with Iran, look, the reality is that, first of all, there is a very complicated history. Certainly the United States and Iran, and I'm not going to go through all of it, but it starts with the United States being a hero to Iran right after World War II. Then comes the coup, not so much of a hero anymore. Then comes the revolution, more complications. Then comes Iran, Iraq, and chemical weapons being, it's a long, long story. So one should not expect that there can be anything other than very, very deep mistrust between the countries. However, there's also a lot of mistrust of Iran with the international community. And that is evidenced by the fact that the economic sanctions were so effective. Why were they effective? It wasn't because the United States had unilateral sanctions, because the world was doing it, because Iran was caught doing activities that were at least certainly relevant to a nuclear weapons program. So look, there's a lot there, and that's also one reason why I think that it's so important to use the time of 15 years wisely. The agreement, as far as I'm concerned, stands on its own. It's a highly technical agreement. Some have called it anal retentive, but that was the point, so that quotes cheating would be more constrained. It stands on its own, but I have to say it would be disappointing if it did not, over a 15-year time period, give some opportunity for a broader opening. Unfortunately, now things have gone in the wrong direction as even new problems come up with Yemen and Syria and the like. So, that's why there's a great sensitivity, and I can assure you the sensitivity to their nuclear weapons program is not something that only the United States in that negotiation was pushing. Our partners were all on the same page. In fact, and I'll end by saying, in fact, at the end of the negotiation, which was July 14th, 2015, one member of our country group, a foreign minister, noted that history might judge the U.S.-Russia agreement in this negotiation to be more remarkable than the agreement with Iran. Because this was all during Ukraine, and yet there was never a wedge driven between us on the negotiations.
So one more Iran question. During the negotiations, there were MIT alums on either side of the table. And how did this affect the negotiating dynamic?
And I might add, 3 out of the 4 principal negotiators had American PhDs. You have to figure out, of course, who the 4th was. And it wasn't an Iranian. Ali Salehi was my negotiating partner. He graduated a PhD in nuclear engineering here in 1977 or 78 maybe. And he was a student, by the way. I don't know if he's Mike Driscoll. I don't know if Mike is here, but was very, very close to Mike Driscoll and to Mujib Kazemi, our late dear friend. Anyway, it was an enormous advantage. First of all, it was an enormous advantage, frankly, that both Salehi and Zarif had American PhDs, meaning they're familiar with the country, familiar with we could do all the negotiations in English, which is an enormous advantage for building relationships. With Salehi, it was special because we had common friends, and although, again, as I said, I could not say the countries have trust, but I would say we developed absolutely personal trust in what we were talking about, that we could deliver. We had the backing we knew to deliver. So that was very important. And also, one story that wasn't in the paper, but I can't resist then saying, is that, Naomi actually went and bought the stuff at the MIT bookstore, that in the second meeting, and it was very intense, in the second meeting, his first grandchild was born, a girl, and we got him some MIT gifts so that he could be in nerd heaven again, and you can't beat this one, and for this audience it should be easy. A onesie, a pink onesie with 2 atomic element symbols for copper and tellurium. Get it? Get it? So,
Love it.
after that, everything went easily.
Okay, all right. One question on North Korea. So North Korea's nuclear ambitions are not irrational. It's a fact that fully nuclear powers enjoy a privileged status in the global political discourse. What's the best way to address the uncomfortable fact that possessing nuclear weaponry does, in fact, afford nations a more prominent seat at the table?
I think that was implicit in what I suggested in terms of a path forward. Ultimately, it's about convincing and providing a pathway to a more prosperous society, integrated with partners, and secure. And again, I said earlier, I don't think we have adequately addressed the real security needs of any of the countries in the region. And that's where we have to start.
Great.
And you know, there are countries who have given up nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons programs. And so, you know, and part of that is, in some cases, it's security guarantees that we have to provide. And other times it's economic. Look, I was just in Kazakhstan in August, and you should remember, Kazakhstan became independent in 1991, the Soviet Union's breaking apart. They would have been, I think, the world's fourth largest nuclear power, given the Soviet nuclear weapons in Kazakhstan. And it's very interesting. President Nazarbayev, sorry, getting into stories, but President Nazarbayev apparently grew up in the region not too far from the Soviet test site in Kazakhstan, Semipalatinsk, which had well-known health problems, shall we say, for some of the residents, above-ground testing, et cetera. And he just feels it in his bones. And when they went independent, he just said, take the weapons. He wasn't asking for anything. He just, I'm worse off with them than I am without them. And so I think, you know, that's where we have to go.
Okay, so there were a lot of similar questions on nuclear power, and they were all along the lines of, do you think the U.S. will see new nuclear power generation in the coming decades? And is it possible to reach deep decarbonization targets without it?
Well, obviously it's possible, but I think it's a lot harder. I mean, you know, this is not a simple job to get to, you know, especially deep decarbonization on a generational timescale, and we need every arrow in the quiver. We also should recognize that solutions, the low carbon solutions, will look very different in different countries, and they will look very different in different regions of our country. So if I believe Germany absolutely will get rid of nuclear power. Okay, but other countries will build nuclear power. In our country, right now, the main problem is the schedule and cost performance of the new plants, reactors that at least have been being built in the southeast. But you know, in terms, if you look at decades, again, you know, I'm guardedly optimistic that the small modular reactors can make a difference. But they won't make a difference if, frankly, there is not, and John Deutsch also chaired a committee for SEAB on terms of future reactors, but it ain't going to happen without a strong government push to do it. I don't mean handouts, but I mean a strong government push to do it. And there are ways of doing it with purchase power agreements, potentially, all kinds of ways. That's up to them to pick the right policy tools to do it. But I certainly think it's important.
Okay, lots of questions on climate change.
One other thing on that, just to say, without getting into detail, but we did a paper on this recently that for the United States, there's also a pretty strong national security imperative for wanting a strong domestic supply chain in the nuclear business. It is the foundation of much of our non-proliferation activity globally. Secondly, we literally do not have the capability today to supply nuclear fuel, for example, for the Navy. We're living off of a stockpile of stuff that'll go for a while, but our supply chain is not, shall we say, a chain. It's got a few links here and there.
Okay, let me do just a couple of questions on climate change and climate change policy. So several questions about the role of low-tech changes in human behavior and cultural practice, such as in the food system and land use, and what role do you see those playing relative to the high-tech innovation solutions?
I think actually it's quite important. And with efforts, it's surprising how effective it is. Okay, this is going to be another anecdote on an aside, but I had the pleasure of waving the green flag, the starting flag, for a NASCAR race. And the reason is that we had an agreement with them in terms of energy efficiency, clean energy, and actually they require 15% ethanol in the NASCAR races, et cetera, et cetera. But what was then interesting, and I didn't know about, that's all the stuff that we collaborated with them on. But what I didn't know about is, in the Northeast, there probably aren't a whole lot of big NASCAR fans here, but they have an educational campaign on things like recycling, and there have been polls done that in the sports world, the NASCAR fans are the most recyclers. So, so anyway, so it is education, it's behavior, and so it's kind of interesting.
Okay, so given the critical role for climate
And by the way,
action.
I waved the flag, and there was a crack up at the first turn.
Oh.
It's true.
Okay. Given the critical role for climate action at state and local levels, and given the lack of leadership from the federal administration, should MIT publicly be advocating for specific policies, such as carbon pricing at the state level?
Well, okay. MIT is one thing. Faculty, students of MIT is something else, right? I think, MIT institutionally is about doing hard, fact-based analysis, and I think that's the job of MIT, and it's the job of, I think when we have faculty groups putting out things, future of studies, et cetera, they have to be well-grounded, kind of bulletproof in terms of analysis and recommendations. Now, obviously, then faculty in their other roles, look, including me right now, obviously I do things that I don't say, this is MIT speaking, but we will advocate for specific policies. And in this case, for example, to me, it's unambiguous. A nice, simple carbon charge is probably the most effective way to go forward. It could be that revenue neutral. It could be other ways of doing it. It may not be the theoretically prettiest way, but in the real world of politics, I think it's probably one of the best chance.
Okay, so we're gonna come close to closing it up here.
Let me just say again, actually, that, and while, leadership from the cities and the states has been and will be critically important, the reality is, in the end, we're going to have to get some kind of economy-wide approach, and that's just going to have to have federal leadership.
Okay, the final category is other.
Other.
Yeah. Your hairstyle.
Red Sox will come in first. Right.
Your hairstyle has
10
drawn
games
comparisons.
to go. Say it again?
You're avoiding this question.
Oh, yeah. I don't like other.
Well, there's a good reason for that. Your hairstyle has drawn comparisons with a plethora of famous figures, including George Washington, Beethoven, and the Quaker Oats man. Did you?
Don't forget Sam Adams beer.
Did you consciously choose a hairstylist who's a student of history?
I'm a conservative. I haven't changed since graduate school.
Okay, and the final question. At your Senate confirmation hearing, you introduced Naomi as your wife of 39.83 years. Does marital success in any way benefit from tracking the longevity of a relationship to many significant figures?
Well, okay, first let me tell the rest of that story. And that is that Al Franken, known to have a sense of humor, when it came around to his turn, he had been calculating furiously what that meant working backwards. And he said, Dr. Moniz, is it true that you were married on June the 10th, 1973? And I said, no. And it turned out I didn't have enough significant figures. It was a genuine ambiguity between the June 9th and June 10th. So Franken kind of had it, right? So anyway.
Okay.
Anyway, it's good to keep count because we're beginning to think it might work out.
Ernie, thank you very much, and welcome back to MIT.
Thank you.